A black executive, freshly promoted to vice president, walks into an upscale hotel for a conference ready to lead a groundbreaking presentation. But within moments, everything shifts. A security guard stops him at the entrance, demanding proof he belongs there. The questions escalate, and just minutes later, the executive finds himself standing outside, humiliated, with his invitation dismissed as suspicious. What happened next shocked everyone and triggered a wave of change no one could have predicted. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we dive in, drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from today. If you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to like and share because what happened here might hit closer to home than you think. It started as just another day, but by the end, it would be anything but ordinary. The airport, as always, was a place of transition, a liminal space where lives intersected briefly before scattering like seeds to the wind. Miles Carter stood at gate 12, his overnight bag slung across his shoulder, watching the early morning crowd shuffle and sway. To the untrained eye, it was an ordinary day. But Miles had long since learned to read the air, and this morning, the weight of it pressed down on him like a second skin. He tugged gently at the collar of his shirt, feeling the sharp edges of the metal pinned beneath the fabric. Bronze star. It wasn't something he liked to show off. But on days like this, he found strange comfort in its presence. A reminder that his worth wasn't up for negotiation. Mr. Carter? A woman's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She was smiling, but the kind of smile meant to disarm rather than welcome. Her uniform was crisp, and the badge on her chest reflected the light above. TSA. Miles nodded politely. Yes, ma'am? Could you step over here for a moment? There it was. The first barrier, subtle but deliberate. Miles followed her to the side, aware of the glances trailing behind him. He could feel them like fingerprints on glass. The officer gestured to his bag. Routine check, she said, though he hadn't seen anyone else pulled from the line. Miles set the bag down without protest. He'd been through this dance before. She unzipped the bag carefully, but her eyes weren't on the contents. They were on him. You traveling for work? She asked. Her voice casual, but Miles heard the undercurrent beneath it. Heading home, he answered. She nodded slowly, as if that piece of information shifted something in her mind. And you live where? Miles exhaled softly. Georgia, Savannah. There was a beat of silence, just long enough to make her next question seem inevitable. And you serve, Mr. Carter? Miles met her gaze. Yes. Army. 2 tours. The words were a key that unlocked the moment. She nodded quickly and zipped the bag shut. Thank you for your service, she said, her tone warming slightly. You're good to go. Miles slung the bag back over his shoulder, resisting the urge to adjust the metal beneath his shirt. Appreciate it, he replied, though the appreciation didn't quite settle. As he walked away, he felt the eyes linger. They always lingered. In the waiting area, Miles settled into a corner seat by the window, the plane still distant on the tarmac. Outside, the sky was wide and unbothered. He wondered how it was that the world could feel so open from 1,000 feet above, yet so narrow down here where feet touched the ground. A young boy sat 2 rows over, knees pressed up against the glass. His mother, a few seats away, watched him with soft eyes. Miles remembered being that age, wondering if the sky belonged to anyone or if it was as free as it seemed. The boy turned suddenly, his eyes locking with Miles. For a brief second, there was no hesitation, just curiosity. You fly planes? The boy asked, loud enough for those around to hear. Miles smiled. Not planes. Helicopters. The boy's eyes widened. Like the army kind? Exactly like that. The boy's mother sat up straighter now, her gaze shifting to Miles with a mix of recognition and something else. Something harder to name. My brother flew in Vietnam, she said, offering the information like a bridge between them. Came home different, though. Miles nodded, knowing the shape of that story too well. Yes, ma'am, a lot of us do. Before she could say more, the announcement rang overhead. First-class boarding. Miles stood, adjusting his bag. The boy watched him carefully, eyes wide with admiration. You're first class? Miles grinned. Surprises me too sometimes. But as he walked toward the gate, he felt the subtle shift in the room. The tightening of something invisible but present. Like a thread pulled too taut. At the gate, a flight attendant with perfectly pinned hair and sharp eyes stepped forward, blocking the entrance just slightly. "Sir, I think you may be in the wrong line. Economy boarding will begin shortly." Miles handed her the ticket. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," he said, his tone calm but firm. She studied the ticket longer than necessary, lips pressing into a thin line. "Enjoy your flight," she finally said, stepping aside. Miles nodded, but as he crossed into the jet bridge, he couldn't shake the weight of the moment. The quiet reminder that even now, after everything, there were still doors people hesitated to open for him. The sky, it seemed, was a mirror, and no matter how far he flew, some reflections were harder to escape. The first-class cabin hummed softly with quiet conversations and the low clinking of glass. Miles took his seat by the window, feeling the stares dissolve into polite, practiced indifference the moment he made eye contact. It wasn't new. No, he recognized this silence. It was the same hush that filled rooms when certain men walked in. Men who were never expected to occupy space beyond the edges. He'd learned long ago how to carry that silence without letting it settle into his bones. The seat beside him was empty. A few minutes passed before a man in a gray suit approached, pausing just long enough to glance at the ticket in his hand. His eyes flickered toward Miles, hesitation pooling in the small space between them. "This is row 4? Miles gestured to the seat. "Right here." The man lingered for a moment longer than necessary, like he was waiting for something. Perhaps confirmation that there hadn't been a mistake. Miles turned back to the window, watching the tarmac. The man slid into the seat, the leather creaking softly under his weight. "Can I get you something to drink?" The flight attendant had reappeared, smiling wide but speaking only to the man in the gray suit. Miles waited, patient. The man ordered a whiskey. "Neat." The attendant nodded, her eyes briefly passing over Miles before drifting back, her pen hesitating above the pad. "And for you, sir?" Miles smiled politely. "Water's fine." Her nod was curt, as if relieved by the simplicity of the request. Miles could feel the man's eyes now, measuring him the way people do when something doesn't quite fit. It wasn't hostile, just curious, like spotting a hawk perched on a city lamppost. Out of place, yet undeniably there. "Military?" the man asked finally, his voice low but edged with the kind of ease that comes with ownership of spaces like these. "Army," Miles replied without looking over. "Retired." "Thought so. I can usually tell." Miles glanced sideways, the reflection of the man's pale hands resting on his knee catching the corner of his eye. "That right?" The man chuckled softly, swirling his whiskey. "You carry yourself a certain way. Like you've been to places most people haven't." Miles let the words hang for a moment. Places don't carry as much weight as people think. The man seemed to consider that but said nothing more. When the plane began to taxi, the seatbelt sign blinked overhead. The hum of the engines grew louder, and the world outside the window started to slide backward. Miles settled in, feeling the gentle pull of momentum. And then it happened. A voice carried from somewhere in the cabin, soft but sharp enough to cut through the hum. "I just don't understand why they'd put us through this when there are perfectly good seats up front." Miles didn't need to turn to know who had spoken. The voice belonged to a woman whose perfume, faint but distinct, had drifted by his row moments earlier as she passed. "Well," another voice responded, a man's this time. "You know how it is these days. Can't say much about it anymore." Miles felt the heat rise in his chest. Slow and steady, the man beside him shifted in his seat, clearing his throat awkwardly, as if trying to pretend he hadn't heard. Miles let out a quiet breath, leaning back into the headrest. He'd been here before. These moments were always small, like pinpricks, never enough to bleed openly, but sharp enough to remind you that the wound was still there. Just beneath the skin, the plane lifted, and as the wheels left the ground, Miles found himself wondering how far one had to fly before the weight of such things fell away. Miles never expected trouble in the small things. A hotel key was just a sliver of plastic, a number embossed, a logo printed, easily forgotten in the pocket of his coat. But somehow, In certain hands, even a key could carry weight. The lobby of the Orion Hotel shimmered with marble floors and muted chandeliers. Miles had stayed here before. Twice. Maybe 3 times over the years. Long enough to know the doorman's name, Henry, and how the elevator creaked between the 7th and 8th floors. He approached the front desk with a quiet ease. Checking in, Miles said, placing his reservation number on the counter. The clerk, a young man with hair slicked back too neatly, glanced up briefly, his eyes skimming over Miles's pressed blazer and worn duffel bag. His hands hovered over the keyboard. Welcome to Orion. Name, please? Miles Granger. The clerk typed without speaking, the rhythm of the keys breaking the hush of the lobby. For a long moment, nothing else passed between them. Miles leaned against the counter, letting his gaze drift toward the oversized floral arrangement standing just beside the entrance. Granger, the clerk's voice trailed off. His brows pinched slightly, fingers slowing. We don't seem to have a reservation under that name. Miles straightened slightly, pulling the printed confirmation from his wallet. It's there, he said, sliding the paper forward. Booked 2 weeks ago. Room 811. The clerk took the paper with reluctant fingers, eyes narrowing as he scanned the details. Ah, he said finally. I see. My mistake. He smiled, but it was thin, like something stretched too tightly over uncertainty. Let me just get your key. Miles heard the soft beep as the machine activated the card. The clerk slid it across the counter. Enjoy your stay, Mr. Granger. The exchange was simple, routine, and yet, as Miles turned to leave, he caught the sound of something else. The shuffle of hurried footsteps behind him. Excuse me, sir? Miles stopped, glancing over his shoulder. A second clerk, this one older, gray creeping into his hair, stood by the desk, keycard in hand. I believe there's been a mix-up, the man said, holding up the card. This is for room 811. Miles frowned slightly, lifting the key in his hand. That's the one I was just given. The older clerk hesitated, his gaze flickering between Miles and the younger man behind the desk. There was a double booking. The older man said slowly. This room was originally set aside for another guest. Miles exhaled softly through his nose, letting the words settle in the air between them. I reserved that room, Miles said, his tone calm but firm. 2 weeks ago, same as I always do. The older man nodded. I understand, sir. But the guest, quote. A voice cut through the lobby. I don't see why this is so complicated. A man stood a few feet away, hands in his coat pockets. His gaze slid toward Miles. But it didn't linger. I'm in town for a conference. The man added, his voice even but edged. Room 811 was supposed to be mine. Miles met his eyes then. The man wasn't angry, just certain, the kind of certainty that couldn't be undone by paperwork or plastic keycards. The older clerk glanced between them again, and Miles could feel the scales tipping. For a moment, the silence stretched too thin. I'll take another room, Miles said finally. The older man looked relieved, nodding as he returned to the computer. We have availability on the 4th floor. Let me upgrade you to a suite. No extra charge. Miles nodded, slipping the new key into his pocket. The man from the conference walked past without another glance, his original key still in hand. The elevator ride to the 4th floor was quiet, but the reflection in the metal doors stayed with him. Miles thought about that second key, how it had lingered just long enough in the other man's hand to feel heavier than plastic should. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. Miles stood by the window of his hotel room, the lights of the city stretching endlessly below him. The 4th floor suite was larger than the one he'd booked, more space than he needed. The glass was cool beneath his fingertips as he traced idle patterns against the surface, watching the taxis thread through the streets like slow-moving stars. A knock sounded at the door. When Miles opened it, a bellman stood outside, holding a small tray with a folded envelope resting on top. From the manager, sir, the young man said, his tone polite but distant. Miles thanked him, sliding a few bills into his palm before shutting the door. He placed the tray on the desk and unfolded the envelope. A single line was written inside. We apologize for the misunderstanding. Please enjoy your stay. No signature. No name. Miles crumpled the note, letting it fall to the corner of the desk. He'd seen apologies like this before. The kind that existed to smooth things over without ever addressing what truly needed fixing. It was the nature of things. The following morning, Miles stepped into the hotel's dining area. The hum of conversation filled the space. Soft murmurs over coffee cups and the gentle clinking of silverware. He found a table near the corner, out of the way but with a clear view of the room. A waitress appeared after a few minutes, her eyes skimming the tables quickly before stopping on him. She was young, perhaps in her early 20s. Blonde hair tied back tightly, a nervous energy clinging to her like perfume. Morning, she said, not quite meeting his gaze. Miles nodded politely. Coffee, black. She scribbled the order and lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, her eyes flicking to the empty seat across from him. Are you expecting someone to join you? No, Miles replied. Just me. She smiled, but there was something uneasy about it. Like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to. I'll be right back with that coffee, she said, moving quickly toward the counter. Miles watched her go, noting how her posture straightened when she approached the table 2 rows down. A pair of men in crisp suits sat there, laughing softly between bites of breakfast. She poured their refills without hesitation. He could feel the difference, even from across the room. It was subtle, so slight that most would have missed it. But Miles had learned long ago that racism wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, stitched into the fabric of daily life, woven into the smallest gestures. The shift in tone, the extra beat of hesitation, the faintest flicker of doubt in someone's eyes. And those quiet moments could weigh heavier than the loud ones. By the time the waitress returned with his coffee, the 2 men in suits had finished their meals and left. She placed the cup carefully in front of him, offering another brief, uncertain smile. Let me know if you need anything else. Miles stirred his coffee slowly, watching as she moved between the tables, disappearing briefly behind the counter. He glanced toward the exit, where a doorman held the door for a steady stream of guests coming and going. The day stretched ahead. Waiting, Miles finished his coffee in silence, leaving the cup empty and untouched long after the warmth had faded. The sun hung lower than Miles expected by the time he stepped outside. Evening folded itself around the city, and the streets glowed with that soft, uncertain light that signals the day's slow departure. His shoes tapped quietly against the pavement as he walked, passing restaurants that spilled jazz into the night air. Laughter from dim-lit bars drifted like smoke, curling at the edges of sidewalks where men in tailored coats stood close to open flames from outdoor heaters. He wasn't a stranger here. Not in the way tourists were. Miles had lived in this city once. Many years ago, before life carried him elsewhere. But places forget people faster than people forget places. The small bookstore at the corner of Park and 12th still stood, though the name on the window had changed. Miles stepped inside. The bell overhead chimed gently, but the man behind the counter barely looked up. It wasn't until Miles crossed into the fiction aisle that he felt it. A quiet shift in the atmosphere. He wasn't being watched, at least not openly. It was something else. The same sensation he felt when walking through certain neighborhoods or entering certain rooms. Miles let his fingers trail along the spines of books, his eyes scanning their faded covers. You need help finding something? The voice drifted from the far side of the store. Miles turned, spotting the man from behind the counter. He stood near the entrance now, leaning against a small display table stacked with travel guides. No, Miles replied, just browsing. The man nodded, but he didn't return to his seat. Miles continued down the aisle, picking up a novel he'd read long ago but couldn't remember clearly. A few moments passed before the man spoke again. Store closes in 20 minutes. Miles glanced at the clock near the register. It was barely past 6. Though the sign said 8. Miles said, setting the book back into its place. The man smiled, but there was no warmth to it. Sometimes we close early if it's slow. There was something about the way he said slowly, stretching the word just slightly. An edge tucked beneath the politeness. Subtle but present. Miles returned the book carefully to the shelf. Right, he said. I won't be long. The man offered no reply. By the time Miles stepped outside, the street lamps had flickered on, their light pooling against the cobblestones. The bookstore door locked behind him with a soft click. He stood there for a moment, listening to the distant rumble of a passing train. It was nothing, he told himself, but he'd been telling himself that for years. It's nothing. The weight of those words pressed heavily on his shoulders. They had been his companion in offices, restaurants, elevators, anywhere silence carried more consequence than confrontation. But silence, Miles realized long ago, was not without cost. It settled in the bones, accumulated over time, until the mere act of existing in certain spaces felt like a negotiation. Like paying a debt that was never owed. As Miles walked toward the hotel, he felt the weight of it again. Not loud, not violent, just heavy. The kind of heavy that polite smiles and folded apologies could not lift. The night stretched long after Miles left the bookstore. His walk back to the hotel was slower than necessary. Not because he was tired. No, the weight he carried tonight wasn't the kind of exhaustion sleep could fix. The city moved around him, bustling as if nothing lay beneath its surface. But Miles knew better. He crossed the street toward a late-night diner. The kind that promised coffee too bitter to drink and conversations that lasted longer than the meals. The bell above the door chimed faintly, and the place was nearly empty except for two men in the corner booth and a young waitress chewing gum behind the counter. Miles sat at the far end, near the window, where the glass was cold against his arm. "Coffee?" the waitress asked. Already holding the pot. He nodded. The cup landed with a soft clink. Steam curling upward. Miles wrapped his fingers around the mug but didn't drink. It was then he noticed the men in the corner glance his way. It wasn't the kind of glance that lasted long. No, just enough to be noticed. Enough to remind him of the unspoken rules in places like this. He'd seen that look before. In diners like this. In towns like this. Miles had learned over the years that you could sit quietly, read your paper, and pretend the glance didn't happen. But the body always remembers. The shoulders stiffen. The breath slows. Even now, after so much time, the sound of footsteps approaching from behind could twist his stomach into knots. Even in. One of the men had drifted from his seat, standing now at the edge of Miles' table. Miles met his gaze. "Evening." The man smiled. The kind of smile people wear when they're deciding how far they can go. "Passing through?" Miles nodded. "Just in town for the night." The man's smile lingered as his eyes flickered over Miles' face. "Didn't think I'd seen you around before." There it was. The familiar dance. Wrapped in polite words but sharpened at the edges. "You wouldn't," Miles said plainly. "I don't live here." Silence stretched between them, the kind that hums just beneath the surface. "Well," the man said, eventually leaning back toward his table. "You have a good night." Miles didn't watch him walk away. But he listened. The waitress returned, this time with the check. "Sorry about him," she said quietly. "Some folks have too much time on their hands." Miles glanced at her. She couldn't have been more than 20. There was something apologetic in the way she avoided his eyes. He nodded. "It's all right," Miles said, though they both knew it wasn't. She lingered longer than necessary. "Coffee's on the house," she added softly before stepping away. Miles watched her go, wondering how many nights she'd felt the same tightening in her chest. It was a small thing. This apology, a quiet offering passed between strangers who understood the weight of spaces not built for them. Miles left a few bills under the cup. When he stepped back onto the street, the air felt colder. The footsteps behind him returned not long after. Miles never saw the two men leave the diner, but their presence stretched behind him, thin as wire, taut as the air on nights like these. He walked toward his hotel, passing beneath the glow of flickering street lamps that barely held the dark at bay. His footsteps, soft and deliberate, echoed louder than they should have. At the edge of the street, near the old hardware store with its dust-laden windows, Miles caught the sound, just far enough behind him to keep from being obvious. Footsteps, measured, pacing him. He kept walking, adjusting his hat and pulling his coat tighter as if the cold alone was what sent the shiver down his spine. Somewhere in the back of his mind, the echoes of his father's voice stirred. You know better than to run. Miles. Keep walking. They want you to hurry. Don't let them think you're afraid. But Miles had learned long ago that fear wasn't something you outran. It stayed inside you, silent and patient, waiting for moments like this. He could feel the weight of it, sitting just beneath the surface, pressing against the calm he wore like a second skin. 3 blocks. That's all that stood between him and the hotel. A distance that once felt ordinary now stretched endlessly, each step a negotiation between the past and the present. He crossed onto the next street, hoping the darkness would swallow him whole. But the footsteps followed, a slow, deliberate reminder that some things never stop following you. Ahead, a man leaned against a lamppost, smoking, his hat tilted low, obscuring most of his face. Miles hesitated, not long, just enough for the smoker to take notice. The man straightened slightly, flicking ash from his cigarette. You lost? It wasn't a question. Not really. Miles stepped into the light, letting it wash over his face. No. His voice was steady. I know exactly where I'm going. The man studied him, eyes narrowing the way men's eyes often did when they saw something they couldn't quite place. Behind him, the footsteps halted. For a moment, the street seemed to hold its breath. Miles knew this scene too well. It played out in different towns, with different faces, but always the same script. A man like him on the wrong side of the street, at the wrong time of night. The weight of history pressed heavy against his back. The smoker's gaze lingered, as if deciding whether tonight would be the night to let it slide, or pull the thread until the whole thing unraveled. Miles waited. He'd learned a long time ago that silence, when wielded correctly, could carry more weight than words. The smoker shifted, eventually turning back toward the lamppost. Long as you know. It was permission, though Miles hadn't asked for it. He nodded, tipping his hat slightly before continuing down the street. By the time he reached the hotel, the footsteps had disappeared, but their imprint remained, stitched quietly into the fabric of the night. Miles stepped inside, greeting the tired man behind the desk with a brief nod. His room felt colder than when he'd left it. The walls stretched tall around him, as if offering sanctuary, but Miles knew better. He sat by the window, watching the street below, the city carrying on as if nothing had happened. Perhaps, to most, nothing had. But for men like Miles, the tightrope was always there, waiting to be walked, night after night. And somewhere, beneath the surface, the ground never stopped trembling. Miles woke early, the first pale light of dawn slipping through the curtains like an uninvited guest. The city outside was beginning to stir. Horns in the distance, footsteps below, the clatter of delivery trucks making their rounds. But inside the room, the quiet held firm. He sat up slowly, the weight of last night still pressing against his chest. Sleep hadn't erased it. The footsteps in the dark. The smoker by the lamppost. The ever-present question hanging in the cold air. Do I belong here? It wasn't a question that faded with sunrise. Miles poured a cup of stale hotel coffee and watched the city unfold beneath him. From his window, the world looked ordinary, innocent, even. People hurried along the streets, some nodding to each other, others too lost in their routines to notice the man observing them from above. And yet, Miles knew better. The men who followed him last night could be down there too, blending into the crowd as if the weight of history didn't cling to their shadows. That was the thing about mornings like these. They dressed themselves in civility. In the daylight, the cracks in the world didn't seem as wide. By the time Miles stepped onto the street, the sun had fully risen, drenching the city in gold. He walked slowly, hands tucked into his coat pockets, eyes scanning the faces that passed him by. At the corner, a woman swept her front stoop, pausing only long enough to watch him walk past. Her gaze lingered, longer than necessary. Miles didn't flinch. He'd grown used to it by now. At the bakery down the block, the owner, Mr. Lewis, caught sight of him through the window. The bell above the door jingled as Miles stepped inside. "Mornin', Miles," Lewis said, his smile tight. "You're up early. Didn't sleep much." Lewis nodded as if he understood. But Miles doubted he did. "You want the usual?" Miles considered for a moment. his eyes drifting toward the back of the shop where a small crowd of regulars gathered. Men in dark suits and pressed hats. Their laughter rising and falling in bursts like a rhythm. Miles wasn't invited to join. Yes, Miles said finally. The usual. Louis disappeared behind the counter. And Miles turned his attention to the newspaper folded neatly by the register. Council votes to delay redevelopment in the 10th ward. The headline stared back at him. The words heavy with everything left unsaid. Miles didn't need to read the article. He already knew how the story played out. The 10th ward, the neighborhood he grew up in, had been dangling on the edge of renewal for years. Not the kind of renewal that brought prosperity. No, this was the sort that erased people like him, paving over histories that no one had written down. He folded the paper back just as Louis returned, placing a warm pastry in front of him. Thanks. Louis hesitated, his eyes flicking toward the men in the back. You have any trouble last night? The question was carefully wrapped, but Miles could see the edges poking through. Nothing I haven't handled before. Louis nodded, but his smile faltered. The walk back to the hotel felt different. The city had grown louder, but beneath the hum of life, there was something else, an absence, a gap where something should have been. Miles passed the diner from last night, its windows fogged from the heat inside. He could see them, the two men, sitting by the door, their faces half hidden behind cups of coffee. One of them looked up. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, neither of them looked away. It wasn't a confrontation that passed between them. It was recognition. Miles tipped his hat slightly, the barest nod of acknowledgement, and kept walking. He knew how this game was played. Back at the hotel, Miles packed his things. His stay was over, but the weight he carried wouldn't be left behind. As he slipped the key into the front desk slot, the old clerk behind the counter gave him a long, unreadable look. Are you heading out, Mr. Freeman? I am. The clerk hesitated. Safe travels. Miles met his gaze, something unspoken hovering between them. Thanks. The train station was alive with movement. Families huddled together, businessmen pacing near the platforms. Miles found his seat by the window, letting the quiet wash over him as the engine rumbled to life. As the train pulled away from the station, he watched the city begin to slip out of view. It didn't matter how far he traveled. Miles knew the road he walked stretched much further than the steel tracks beneath him. It wasn't bound by geography. It was bound by history. And history, he had learned, didn't loosen its grip so easily. But as the train carried him forward, Miles held on to something else. The steady rhythm of movement. The quiet assurance that even tightropes, when walked long enough, can lead somewhere new. Somewhere, far ahead. The tracks ran straight,